Okay.
Okay, great. We found a way. Um, so look, I just wanted to say thanks for having me. My daughter was having an operation earlier, so I wasn't sure if I was going to make it, hence the video. So I'm here, which is great. I got to see most of the talks, and they're so interesting. I'm hoping that mine isn't overly simplistic by comparison. And I just have, in case it is, I have lots of images of kind of cute animals. That was the plan. So it's about incentivizing critical engagement with Gen AI, and talking about two modules that I have been teaching. So I'm just going to move on to the second slide now. So I had some questions for today, which were, how do we use Gen AI to assist rather than obliterate critical thinking skills? And many people have done a great job today in showing how we might do that. Some of the questions that my colleagues have around Gen AI is like, are we going to just open Pandora's box? And if we show them what to do, are they going to just run wild? I really think, that's like the horse has bolted, folks. There's no point in thinking about those kinds of things. But I think in the arts and social sciences, particularly, it can be seen as more of a threat than an opportunity. So we need to figure out the answer to that question. The second one is how we build a community of trust in the classroom, because that's really, really important. I think we need to remind ourselves that we are facilitators of knowledge. We're leading our students to places where they can find more. We're not necessarily the ones who impart all of it. And so we need to be transparent. We need to break down the hierarchy that can exist between lecturers and students in the classroom. And then the third one is, how do we loosen our grip on old habits and rethink assessment? I mean, if anybody is able to tell us about that, I think it's the last presenter. But if we use Gen AI in our coursework and in our assessment, it's going to change the way that we do things. And so all I'm doing today is talking a little bit about how I integrated it into two of my modules. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So these were the two modules that I'm going to be talking about. The first one is Introduction to Literary Criticism and Composition. It's a year one module on the BA Arts program. And the second one is a Narrative Construction, which is a year two module in a BSc in Applied Computing. So we have two very different groups of students here. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So in the first module, I'm going to be talking, it's based in arts. And so in arts and the social sciences, one of the big challenges that we have is the role of the essay and how the essay can benefit our students in some ways. I mean, it manages to help students to create a long form argument that is rooted in research and puts forward a clear theory. And this is actually a valuable skill. I've been thinking a lot about whether we need to retain this or not. But there are certain things about it that are very useful. But along with the advent of Gen AI and how easy it's become for us to generate essay type responses to things, and also lots of seminars on pedagogy and alternative approaches to assessment, I decided that the skills acquired through essay preparation and formation are really valuable, but that a redistribution of marks and the introduction of new modes of engagement have to be encouraged as a valuable response to the challenge and the opportunities that are presented by Gen AI. So Kerwin 2023 talks about the reaction of educators to what he calls the demise of the academic essay and the centrality of staff-student collaboration to successful assessment alternatives. And there's also a project in TU Dublin, the Technological University of Dublin, because I'm based in Ireland, that outlines a number of assessment types, and they provide student commentary on the way that these assessment types align with principles of EDI, UDL, academic integrity, and employability. And regardless of the mode of assessment chosen, the teaching of critical AI literacies was considered to be vital in order for students to be fully informed of institutional policies and practices around academic integrity, but also the practicalities of using Gen AI effectively. So the thing that I realized is, attendance and engagement are actually clearly linked to the acquisition of student AI literacies. The students who aren't attending are the ones who aren't going to think critically about their usage of Gen AI. So we have to actually go back a little bit, and we have to ensure that our classrooms are places of welcome for our students. And so in both case studies that I'm about to talk about, there were a couple of aims, and they're not all related to Gen AI. There was the aim that we needed to place a discernible value on homework that students were asked to complete before class. I wanted to encourage attendance in class, and I wanted to encourage engagement with other students in the classroom, because a lot of the problems that we tend to have are around senses of belonging and connection. I also wanted to relieve the stress of big pieces of continuous assessment at the end of the module. So Gen AI is kind of forcing me back to learning outcomes in a really interesting way. I want to think about what my students really need to do be able to do by themselves, and what it is reasonable for them to outsource. So I'm just moving on to the next slide here, my little pugs. So the first case study is around that first year arts module, Introduction to Literary Criticism and Composition. And we have a large class of students. You know, this group is getting bigger every year. I have 116 first years taking this module. And the purpose of it is to introduce students to academic writing and to some ideas in literary criticism as well that focus on how we read and interpret literature. So they focus on, you know, the author and the reader and the text. And last year I had 7 marked tasks in class, and they often comprised of tasks done in pairs. I actually found it really difficult to mark all of those. And so this year I have 4, and these are completed in groups of maybe 5 students at a time. So that's purely a logistical decision to offset the numbers of students that I have to manage. And in arts and the social sciences, attendance is this real challenge, right? So there's a huge fall off in attendance, we find, after the first few weeks, and that creates loads of problems for students. Not only do they fall behind in their learning, but they actually they miss out on forming and solidifying relationships with staff and their fellow students in a way that gives them a sense of belonging and plays such a huge role, as we all know, in our experience of university, you know. So breaking down assessment was important for me. I wanted them to receive regular wins, you know, that contributed to their final mark. And that was really important to me. And so all these in-class regular tasks were also related to their final essay. And some of them were rooted in GenAI and some were not. So they would all be related to some assessment that was coming up or something that was practically very much geared towards them. And also they were practicing with referencing something that they hadn't ever encountered before. As I said, this presents a huge challenge in relation to marking 116 students. And so I got them working together very early on. And I wanted them to learn from one another, really, during the course of the tasks. And I'm also involved, just incidentally, on a project that uses GenAI to mark assignments, a kind of a local GenAI. And so these marks that I was giving them were cross-checked alongside the GenAI marks were cross-checked alongside my marks to check for how accurate my marking schema is and how much it allows them to make mistakes and for that to be okay. So I found all of that really intriguing. And also I would very often drop the lowest mark for those tasks so that they, you know, missing a class maybe wasn't the most awful thing that would happen to them. For the GenAI poetry analysis in their assessment, I felt it was really important to teach them how to use it, but not for it not to necessarily be the answer to complex problems. And so I wanted them to think about how it might help them fill in knowledge gaps or check the structure of their arguments or offer paths for future research and discussion. So the first part of this assignment took place in groups and it was submitted during a double class. A lot of this stuff was done in class, you know, and so it involved the students prompting a GenAI of their choice to offer a poetry analysis of the poem that we're studying in class, which incidentally is called Fugue for Young and Fugitive by a poet called Needy Zach / Aria Eep, 2 names, and to ask it to reference the poem. That poem is not available online. So the results were very varied and very interesting. And as you can imagine, the AI had to rely on very little information. And so it took an awful lot of information from the title of the poem. And students had to post their results that they found to a Padlet and all of the other students could see it. And that was followed up with a reflective task. Students had to read all of the posts and comment on the referencing errors they spotted and provide the correct final reference themselves, and then discuss the task according to a precise set of prompts, like according to our in-class close reading of the poem, what did the GenAI do well and what did it do poorly, that kind of thing. And so most students were able to identify the pitfalls of relying wholesale on something produced by GenAI or the tendency of it to extrapolate from limited information and things like that. But they could also see that it was really helpful in terms of analysing poetry on a fundamental level, you know, things like how enjambment might work in a regular poem, or, you know, the role of a regular structure and how we read. And then in the final essay, they still need to know how to compose it. But the hope was that the temptation to resort to GenAI to write the thing would be alleviated, because actually by the time they get to write it, they've done a huge amount of the research and a huge amount of the preparatory work before they ever get there. So I'll just move on to the next one because I'm aware of time. So the next one is about was narrative construction, and this is a much smaller cohort of applied computing students. I've only got 16 in this group, and this module is a replacement for these students for a communications module. These are students that are never going to need to write an academic essay, but they might be in a position where they have to share their ideas with colleagues or work according to a very clear brief or employ technology in really effective ways. And a lot of these students don't think of themselves as creative, and they also struggle with interpersonal skills. So part of the module is really about those softer skills. So we had some in-class tasks as well, and they were very much focused on the first few weeks of the module. These students received viewing homework that they had to do. So very tough homework, like watching The Godfather or watching The Shawshank Redemption, and then completing a short task in class on a dramatic principle within that film. And the students had to have some basis, through watching those films on what was considered to be good storytelling in the module. The next assignment, then was a one-page treatment for a short 10-minute film script. And, if you've ever tried to get GenAI to write a film script for you, it can do it straight away. It mightn't be great, but it can do it very quickly. And so it works very well in creating treatments as well. It doesn't necessarily mean the content is that wonderful, but it does it really quickly. So knowing this, I decided to ask the students to employ GenAI to help them to create the initial treatment for the film and then to tweak it in whatever way they wanted before submission. So they didn't have to submit the GenAI version if they thought it was no good. And then the reflection asked them to think critically about their prompt generation and the output of the GenAI in relation to the Aristotelian narrative principles that they'd studied throughout the course of the module. And they also had to provide a link to their chat history. I wanted to see how they arrived at their final version. And then for their pitch and presentation, they were asked to take on board the feedback. They could use GenAI in whatever way they wanted here to create the pitch or to improve, their ideas. And they had to do a presentation that was an act-by-act breakdown and focused on the characters in their story. And so, there was no substitute for standing up in front of the class and doing that. But they could use the GenAI again in any way they wanted. And their reflection involved, reflecting on the GenAI input, but also their own performance during the presentation. The final script then builds on those previous assignments. It's the same story. But again, the reflection asked them to focus on the entire process of writing the script. So the next slide is just about those in-class tasks. It's not necessarily just about AI, to be honest, the GenAI. It's things like how working with others really helps. And so GenAI, as I said, is kind of bringing me back to basics in some ways, social interaction and learning from one another and actually, looking back on what you've done to see if it's any good. And so, things like getting people, out of their comfort zone or learning with others was one of those things that seemed to work really well. So on the next slide then, this is just about, again, bringing us back to those, basics around learning. So arguably, GenAI asks us to rethink the hierarchical, what Paulo Freire would call vertical classroom, in which the power dynamic is really firmly weighted in favor of the lecturer. And a lot of what is evolved in these modules requires readjustments and amendments to assignments as we go. And as a result, there's been a real atmosphere of collaboration and trust that has had to develop. And our assessments have to recognize the experience of doing the assignments, of growing, of belonging, of active learning. So we have to, and they have to recognize our position as continual learners. And, Paulo Freire and bell hooks know the power of that democratic classroom. And ironically, it might be GenAI that helps us to get there. So the last slide is just a few references, that's all, and a little dog with the Christmas outfit, because, that's where we're at. Thanks a million.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's great that you're able to join us, and I do hope your daughter is recovering well.
She is.
We are over time, but if anyone does have a question for Jenny, if you'd like to raise your hand, and we can have one or two questions at the end. John, would you be able to sort out the permissions, please?
Yeah, should be ready, Fiamma.
I'm so excited because you're calling my favorite people critical pedagogy, bell hooks, multicultural classroom. Just that's the only way students will trust you to say don't use it unethically. I know what you're talking about. I feel it, and I've developed, my classroom to that level, and I'm so excited to hear you validate you and I think the last card validates my thoughts in terms of how I'm getting my students to use AI. Now I'm very sure I'm able to convince my colleagues with the things I've heard today and the video around how they should be, talking to students about using it. We're not going. I don't want us to disadvantage students if they go out from here and not be able to compete in the market because the other people. So I don't have a question. I'm just all in for what you said. I'm really grateful for sharing. And thank you so much, Phil. I'm so excited to have been able to join today. I'm so grateful that we can also have the resources later to use. All right. So
No,
excited.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Actually,
Oh,
can I just respond as well to something that was in the chat? Because Kate, you just said, I wonder how this will change in future years as the model gets more data about the poem, and that's a really good question, because that poem is actually a couple of years old, but I suspect this poet will become bigger over time. I think what another thing that it's going to do that will benefit me actually is just to keep my module relevant by looking at things that are kind of coming out, especially from we have some interesting traveller poets or poets of new Irish writers of colour in our country that might not get the same publicity as some other poets, and I think this is my opportunity as well to kind of foreground those as time passes, I hope.